Hello, Dr. Ron England, and this is Advanced WordPress Part 2, and this is a continuation of the team ranking system, which is the case study that I'm using to actually demonstrate our ability to work within WordPress. And I'm actually here in the WordPress. I'm logged into WordPress, so you're actually seeing the page information at the top, but I'm on the page that I'm going to demonstrate how to use. Now, if you watch the previous WordPress video, you know how to now get variables through the URL into the WordPress PHP page, and you also know the relationship between the pages in WordPress and the PHP files behind them as templates. I'm going to assume that you've already got that down pat so that we can move forward, that you've watched that video and you understand that, because we're going to move forward. This page has a couple of neat features. One is it's dynamically generated from the database. So that's kind of a neat thing to be able to do this, is take all the information from the database and toss it right up there on the screen. And it also has some neat features in that it's got this expandable little chunk here where I've got information, which in this case it's just showing the members of the teams that are in the rankings. So now let's look at how we did that in code, and we're gonna go through the entire process of this code here. Now I am now in the code that is the PHP template that is behind this page. And I'm going to first go up to the very top. That little piece that you saw that expanded and contracted the page, the little green thing right here, is actually nothing more than a little bit of database code written in Java, a little bit of JavaScript code that is written to hide and show, which essentially just basically styles the block so that it's either shown or is not shown. That's it. And it's actually one line of JavaScript code in either way. So essentially all you have to do is when the user clicks on that, you expand or contract. And so that can be really easily added to the page in HTML with the JavaScript behind. And that is actually what we're going to do in this page. We're going to use PHP to generate a lot of HTML, and we're just going to echo that HTML to the screen. So let's go down to where all the action actually occurs here. First things first, global WPDB. You need to be able to access the database that's behind WordPress. Now, in my case study here, I have the creation of custom tables that I've created to be able to hold stuff besides the stuff that's normally held in WordPress. That is not difficult to do. The database behind WordPress is a MySQL database. If you use most services that do WordPress, you're going to have access to be able to get through that database. You can use the PHP My Admin tool to do that. You can run SQL queries, and you can create tables and put data into tables. And that is exactly what we did here. So you should have this ability to get to that database, and there are a lot of different ways to do that. So hopefully we'll be able to, you'll know how to do that. If I really have to go through more on how to do that, then I will. Here's the important thing about global WPDB. Now, you should probably look at the codex reference for the WPDB. The codex is the documentation for WordPress, and it explains, but the WPDB class and the WPD object allow you access to the database, and they're relatively straightforward methods of that class that you can use. So if I come back over here to where I've got where I'm using it, right here, $races equals WPDB get results. And if you look at this, you should be able to see that that is just simply a SQL query. And the results of that SQL query are actually going to bring back what we would call a cursor, but the results. The races will have the properties race name, race date, location, short description, race logo file, race web page slug, race kind. Those are all going to be essentially properties of the races, which is going to come back as what I would call a cursor, because a cursor is the results of a SQL query. That's pretty much it. And so now I've got this variable races that contains all the results, all the rows of that SQL query with all those properties. Now, the code that I'm going to do is going to want to go through each of those individual races that it pulled out of the database. And what this does is it actually just, this piece of code is simply getting all the races for that race year that qualify for points. That's it. It's going to bring back those races. And so what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to go through each of those races. And that's where you get to use the good old for each. Okay? So the for each is, and this is PHP, for each races as race. So in other words, it's going to go through that cursor races, just work its way through it, each as a loop, and each time it goes through, the variable of the current race is called race, right here. That is from that cursor, races. Now, we did a whole lot of stuff here, but one of the things that we actually do here is we have an include right here. I get the race name, I get the race date from the race variable that's going through, but I have this big include because a lot of the code that I'm using is going to be repeated over and over and over again, but differently for different pages, but it's essentially the same piece of code. So this page has got a lot of duplication amongst other pages. I basically took the code that was duplicated amongst all those pieces and put them into an include. So let's go to that include. So the first thing I do with that include, because I got the race name and the race date, I've actually got a function that was written that gets it back the ID. The database structure used here, and I'm not going to go into it, but the database structure used here is that every table in the database has a unique identifier that is its ID, and it increments. So it's an auto-incrementing field in the database. So it's always going to be some integer that increments every time a record is inserted. The ID. So we have a unique ID each time. So I simply have a function that gets that from the name and the date. Then there's specific, I want to get some race types, which is just another query that comes out of the database. In this case, what it is that if you have a race, there's actually maybe multiple race types that occur on within the same race. I don't use that line. I don't use that line. They were actually used for a different project, so I'm not going to go into those. I do have now, though, I have another for each. So for each race, there might be multiple races within the race. Okay, those are called race types. So that race types, I got them, and really what they do is they correspond to, if a race is occurring, there might be an elite race, a sport race, and a family race. Or if you were thinking of like road races, you could have a race which would be, let's say, the Winter Park Super Race, which had both a 5K and a 10K. Those are two race types within the same race as far as the logic that's occurring here. But I am going to go through each of those races, each race, I'm going to go through each race type. Then I pull back all the teams that are in the race, and it actually pulls back teams and solos. In the case of what we're doing here, things are usually done by teams, but we do allow solos, and I want them separated. So I actually order by the teams first and the solos second. Okay. Well, once I've got the teams and the solos, now for each race type, I've now got a third inner loop for each team, or solo, but for each team. And for each team, I'm going to get back a bunch of information about that team, which I'm actually getting right here in this SQL query. Now, this is a relatively extensive SQL query, and it does pull back a tremendous amount of information. What I did in my comments was I documented the information in the SQL query that it pulls back for each team. Okay. I wanted all this information because it's stuff that I'm going to be displaying. Okay, so now the last thing that I do as I'm working through this is I'm going to go through for each race type, each team. I am going to go ahead and count up the number of points they got in the different categories. Now, these are adventure races, so they have bike points, trek points, and paddle points. That's actually probably easier to see if you look at the page. They have total points, penalty points, bike points, trek points, and paddle points, and their total score is the sum of all of those things, and it's the total points that we actually want to do a query on. I mean, that we want to actually have the ranking by. But I have to have a separate SQL query. The easiest way to do this is to do a separate SQL query to sum all those up. So I grab all that information, including the penalty points, and I put them all together, and I then put them into a set of parallel arrays. Another concept that we want to get that's really important here, the concept of a parallel array. And in the case of this parallel array, I have team name, website, events, registration ID. I'm going to use, though, like events total, points, byte, points track. Those are pieces that I'm going to actually use. And parallel arrays are exactly what they sound like they are. They're arrays that actually contain, I mean, you could put this into a multiple dimensional array, but notice that each of these arrays uses the same key, the team ID. Okay, well, that's kind of interesting. We now know that we've got these parallel arrays. So now we're going to come back over here to where we did this include. All that code got executed inside of here. All right, so we've got another piece of information here. We're going to actually increment the list of races. The list of races is a piece of HTML that's going to print out at the bottom of the page. Again, I will jump down to the bottom of the page and say, there it is, the list of races that is actually in there. And that's just a straight printout of this list of races variable right here. Now I'm going to do some more interesting PHP. Now remember, I had a group of parallel arrays that all had the same key. I'm going to sort, okay, I'm going to sort on team points TOT, the total team points, because I want to actually go through and print them out in that order. Now I'm going to go a little bit into this concept of sorting here. In PHP, I've got this concept of key value pairs. Now, in the case of the example I'm showing you here in Excel, my key value pairs, my keys are all integers. In this case, in the case of what we're doing here, it's team ID, and I got a number of values. If I were to sort these on value, you would notice that the keys also sort with the values. So if I have my keys in a specific order, the order that I want them in, and I have a set of parallel arrays that use the same key, I can also get all of those other arrays in the same order as long as I go through the order of the array that I sorted on. So that's exactly what we're going to do. AR sort is going to sort on the values, okay? And it's going to do the sort that's in the order that I want it. There are multiple sort functions in PHP. This is a built-in PHP function. Now I'm going to go through each of the different key value pairs inside of the in that array, and I'm going to take a string variable team rank row, and I'm going to build the table that you saw of all the different teams. Let's go back so you can see it again. I'm going to build the table of all the different teams. Let's go all the way here to the top. See each of the different teams. I'm going to build that table by going through it, and this is just going to be HTML that goes to the output. So what do? I just essentially concatenate each time around in this for each. I concatenate and I add in. Okay, in here I've got these are each of the individual rows. I've got the ranking, the value. That's the value of the points total, the events total, points penalty, points byte, points trek, points paddle. And then I threw in a little bit of extra stuff here, which, by the way, has that reference to the JavaScript, which was, by the way, the JavaScript at the top, which, as you recall, I said was something that causes it to collapse or expand. And I threw the variables of the different team members in there, okay, through this other function that I have here with the team. And that's actually going to be what happens if you go ahead and click on the team name. And that piece of code, which is, again, just HTML, is right in here. Okay, with another little SQL query that actually pulls up all the different racers that go with that team member. I have a SQL to do that, and I essentially merge that in and stick that into the HTML in that specific column or along that row. Okay, it's easy again to see if I actually go back to the code and show it. Here is the column, here is the team name, here is the place that I click, and here are the team members. Okay, how is that done in code? Well, underneath the team name, I went ahead and put in an href, which calls in the JavaScript. The JavaScript is going to cause it to expand. The expansion is simply going to contain a bunch of HTML, which is the results of the query to get the team names, and it's simply going to be an expandable block of HTML text, which is this information that I got. So none of this is incredibly challenging. So finally, we output all that information, and all that is one big HTML chunk of HTML that's going to be echoed to the screen, and it's actually in this variable team rank row. Now, the last thing that I do here is I go ahead and I create the header for the table. Okay, and that's all this is. These are just the headers. This is all just straightforward text. Okay, then I go ahead and I add to the table the team rank row, which is, by the way, now a very large string. Then I have this include here, and I have this include here, which are just basically the pieces that you see at the top here and the bottom here. That's an include. Okay, that's just some, again, HTML text. And then I echo it all to the screen. And that's it. So, important concepts that you learned here. Okay, big things. I've got the ability to throw in JavaScript to do stuff. And that JavaScript can be put into the PHP file, and it can actually be called from anywhere in the HTML that you generate and echo to the screen. I have the WPDB global variable, which allows me to get things from the database, and I can also insert things in the database. That's not what I'm doing right here. I have the ability to pull in the race year from the URL, which I demonstrated in part 1. And then I showed how to create cursors by actually creating queries that are basically SQL queries to the database. I am not going to cover SQL in this. I have an entire series on advanced SQL. If you want to learn how to do that, learn it. But these are tables that we built that go into the MySQL database. That is also where the WordPress stuff is stored. Once you have these cursors, you can then go through the cursors with the for each, where you take the cursor and then just echo each of the individual rows in the cursor and use that information. And in our case, what we're doing is we're using that information to build up a large table and make that table display. Okay. Again, nothing that we covered in this is incredibly challenging. It's just putting together small pieces to make a really good cohesive whole, and our results speak for themselves. This beautiful page which has all this information, and we can do things like this. This ends essentially this case study in Advanced WordPress. So there will be some other Advanced WordPress videos coming in, but they're going to utilize other case studies so that we can learn other concepts. They'll cover things like how to push to the database, how to build forms, and things like that. Not forms that are built-in plugins, but forms that are truly forms that you build. Thank you very much, and good programming. Thanks for watching parts 1 and parts 2 of this Advanced WordPress.